have to say that honestly, like, it feels like Rafa made this job really easy in demonstrating some of the efficacy of underground research methods. But for me, this all came up as an issue because shortly after presenting on behalf of the DMT Nexus at the Psychedemia Conference back in 2012 at the University of Pennsylvania, I was actually interviewed by a Harvard graduate student who wanted to discuss the decision-making process related to pursuing psychedelic research. And towards the end of that interview, he asked me a question that I couldn't get out of my head. You know, it lingered well past the interview, and he asked why I felt there was a need for underground psychedelic research. Personally, I was kind of surprised to get that question, as the need for psychedelic research has always seemed self-evident to me. Psychedelics challenge so much of what we're commonly told about the nature of reality and existence, sort of like, how could we not research these things? And at first glance, the profound questions surrounding psychedelics, combined with the fact that they're currently criminalized, seems to generate a de facto need for underground psychedelic research. That is to say, if we need to research these things and they're illegal, then perhaps engaging in criminal activity is a viable or perhaps even necessary route to find things out about them. None of this is to deny sanctioned psychedelic research. I don't deny that they've found some really amazing results, especially over the past decade. But in my opinion, there's not enough psychedelic research, nor do I feel that there could ever be enough psychedelic research within the context of institutions set within a prohibitionist paradigm. Underground research has repeatedly pushed the envelope of our knowledge of psychedelics and has gone beyond sanctioned research, the most notable realms being the areas of extraction research and phytochemical knowledge. These underground contributions are essentially indivisible from the broader body of psychedelic research, but have paradoxically been dismissed by some, but certainly not all, sanctioned psychedelic researchers. And this was essentially the essence of the response that I gave in the interview. I was very happy with it, even when the interviewer pushed back and said that psychedelic research is becoming more and more accepted and actually running in relatively mainstream publications. You know, I repeated that we've shown things that sanctioned research hasn't covered, and we can cover areas that various bureaucratic review boards would likely never approve of. And that's where I left it. Like I said, I was quite happy with my answer, and it wasn't until later when I was in the shower that suddenly I was sort of shocked to realize that I'd omitted a really key component, and I just stood there stunned. Why do we need underground psychedelic research? Because not everyone has access to the privilege required to become a sanctioned psychedelic researcher, and sanctioned institutions have pre-existing agendas that limit the scope of psychedelic research. Yes, the fact that psychedelics are illegal lends itself to underground research, but the reason that there's a necessity for underground psychedelic research is because the institutions required to legitimize psychedelics are exclusive loci, points at which financial security and institutional politics intersect, providing a sort of a safe haven for a select few to engage in what is seen as legitimate psychedelic research. This isn't to disparage the fact that these individuals have access to this ability, but simply to examine the assumptions behind the question of why is there a need for underground research. Questioning such a need assumes that sanctioned psychedelic research can examine all of the interesting questions, that the institutions and researchers sanctioned to engage in psychedelic research should have a monopoly on that research, and that becoming a sanctioned researcher is possible to anyone who's passionate about psychedelics. A cursory glance at the credentials of the top names in psychedelic research present a laundry list of the top of academic certification from the top institutions in the world. Or put another way, even if everybody that's engaged in psychedelic research of any stripe, specifically underground, had the desire to legitimize their research through gaining these credentials, such a goal would be largely unattainable. In the US, scholarships aside, post-secondary academic credentials are available only to people who are wealthy enough to bear the financial burdens of pursuing such degrees, or those brave enough to risk repaying mind-boggling amounts of student loan debt. This is the result of a number of economic and social factors, including ever-increasing financial costs of post-secondary education, rapidly growing economic inequality, a job market where real wages and benefits have stagnated for some 50 years, and the transition from an unsustainable production economy to an unsustainable so-called service economy. To pretend that post-secondary education or credentialed psychedelic research is available to anyone who desires it or is passionate and capable of pursuing it is really to ignore the stark realities of the societies in which we live. Sanctioned research institutions have their own agendas and motivations. Alongside an increasing drive towards profit motives in academia, we also see that there are widely accepted trends among various schools of thought. This isn't really anything new. Warring schools of thought are arguably as old as academia itself. However, these trends do affect what can and can't be brought into the academy, and also affect what has a chance of sustaining anything remotely close to adequate funding. When we're discussing a field of study as radically at odds with dominant culture as psychedelic research, it's important to acknowledge that these trends and currents are actively engaging with research abilities and research agendas. It's also worth noting that academia has increasingly represented the privatization of knowledge, and that while underground researchers may have their own forms of groupthink, it tends to be different groupthink than academic circles, and many underground researchers actively work towards, or work against the privatization of knowledge and present an explicit disdain towards such privatization. Additionally, there is at least, at present, a limit on what sanctioned institution research organizations will fund and permit with regards to psychedelic research. Much of the current research deals with the utilization of psychedelics as medicines or substances that can help people regain some sort of lost functionality. This approach is visible in countless studies. This is just a taste of what's out there, but numerous studies fall into these sorts of investigations. And while this research is incredibly meritorious, focusing on psychedelics solely as medicines doesn't really address their full scope, and also risks falling into puritanical notions of what qualifies as a medicine and what qualifies as a drug. Psychedelics are far too important to be co-opted by the false dichotomy between medicine and drug, where substances used for purposes other than treating pathologies are viewed as illegitimate. Or, as we've seen with cannabis, where researchers actively try to remove the psychedelic or psychoactive compounds from these substances while preserving their medicinal effects. Personally, I would posit that in many cases, psychoactive effects are medicinal effects, or at the very least, that the medicinal benefits observed by researchers are essentially indivisible from the psychoactive effects that take place. Additionally, this notion of using substances for the preservation of a fixed functional whole seems somewhat limited to psychedelics and perhaps psychoactive substances more broadly. Currently, you can walk into a myriad of health and supplement stores and buy over-the-counter large quantities of compounds that are designed to enhance your bodily and cognitive performance. However, governments have declared a litany of substances that can also improve bodily and cognitive performance, but are also psychoactive, illegal, under the false premise that these compounds are hazardous to the health of people who ingest them. To quote Terence McKenna's alleged quoting of Timothy Leary, LSD is a psychedelic drug which occasionally causes psychotic behavior in those who have not taken it. Skepticism towards underground researchers from both sanctioned researchers and the general public are not uncommon. The attitudes expressed towards underground researchers includes notions of what real research is, in what contexts real research can take place, and the assertion that underground researchers are just looking to get high. While I don't deny that ecstatic states can be meritorious in their own right, with no need to apply research criteria to the experience or the underlying mechanisms, claims of hedonism masquerading as psychedelic research simply don't bear out if you actually examine the body of what underground research has done. Additionally, claims about what qualifies as legitimate research tend to vary depending on who gives the critique and what their area of expertise is. I suppose you might say that to some extent, research is in the eye of the beholder. The obvious question is who has the authority to declare what is or is not legitimate research, especially within an academic paradigm that generally eschews truly interdisciplinary approaches. Is there not a plurality of research methods? I mean, even if their methodologies and subject matters differ greatly, don't anthropologists and physicists both engage in research? Or to take this inquiry one step further, why should the academy have a monopoly on research? Is it only possible to engage in meritorious research within an academic context? Sanctioned research institutions have been around for a fraction of human history. And additionally, the work of researchers like George Ricart, people like Nikola Tesla, Marie Curie, and Garrett Morgan have shown that there's plenty of very meritorious research that can be carried out by non-credentialed individuals who, in many cases, exist outside of traditionally sanctioned academic institutions. On the flip side, academic credentials don't necessarily guarantee meritorious research. Take the abysmal work of Dr. George Ricart, the Johns Hopkins researcher who claimed that MDMA damaged dopamine neurons and could cause Parkinson's disease, but was later found out to have used methamphetamine rather than MDMA in his research. Additionally, we also have government research institutions such as NIDA, which has made statements such as this. So, we can see that the fact that research is carried out by a credentialed individual or within an academic or other sanctioned context doesn't necessarily guarantee meritorious research. Two large questions remain. What has underground research done, and what can underground research do? To the former, there's a body of evidence from which I'll draw a number of notable examples. And to the latter, I'll propose some ideas and suggestions, but I'd like to emphasize that this is an open horizon that should be determined by people that are engaged in underground research. To examine what underground research has done, I'll focus exclusively on projects we've carried out at the DMT Nexus. However, as you can see here, we are by no means the only group engaged in such research. And actually, it's because there's so many of these groups, many of which I'm totally unfamiliar with, that I would really caution people who have ideas about what we are or are not doing to really dig into the body of research before spouting preconceived notions. Research at the Nexus generally falls into categories of chemical and phytochemical analysis, extraction methodologies, and attempts to quantify, classify, or otherwise engage with the subjective experience induced by psychoactive compounds. We also have smaller research into propagation methodologies for different plants, but you can find a lot more of that at Share the Seeds. So as far as phytochemical analysis, we've engaged in novel analyses of numerous plants used in ayahuasca and other psychoactive and psychedelic preparations. We've used methodologies including thin layer chromatography, gas and liquid chromatography, and mass spectrometry. And we've actually produced the results of our findings as well as the methodologies, which are online and available for critique or peer review to anyone who wishes to do so. Here's a brief look at some of our findings. So this particular plant is Banisteriopsis caapi. It was labeled as black ayahuasca. We did a basic sodium hydroxide precipitation and then analyzed that. And as you can see, the main alkaloid is harmine, followed by minor amounts of harmaline and even lesser amounts of tetrahydroharmine. This is Banisteriopsis muricata. This is related to Banisteriopsis caapi and has also been used to prepare ayahuasca. This extraction was a methanol soak, as Rafa described for crude extractions for performing thin layer chromatography. And again, you can see the main alkaloid here is harmine with very minor amounts of tetraharmine, and we found no harmaline in this vine whatsoever. This is a folk varietal of Banisteriopsis caapi known as Ourinhos in Brazil, or little gold. And the really interesting thing about this was that we found a significant amount of ketotetrahydronorharmine, which is a compound that's been described in the literature a handful of times, but there's no real information about its activity or what it might be doing in the plant. And so this raises questions as to whether or not this compound is consistently found within this folk varietal, and if so, what effects, if any, does it have on the experience? This is a sample of Diplopterus cabrerana, which many people claim has 5-methoxy-DMT in it. Our analysis found no 5-MeO-DMT, just an N-DMT, and very minor trace amounts of other compounds. Here is analysis of Acacia obtusifolia. The top is twigs and the bottom are leaves, or technically phyllodes. As you can see, both of these have really clean DMT profiles, and one of the advantages of knowing this means that you don't need to harvest bark from acacias, which is actually really detrimental to them. We've had a lot of folks in Australia reporting large groves of acacias being killed off by DMT extractors who are likely selling, given the quantities that we're seeing stripped off. So if you're working with acacias, you know that you can harvest them sustainably using twigs and phyllodes. In this case, this is obtusifolia. For Acacia acuminata phyllodes, we found that the major alkaloid present was MTHBC, which is a really long named beta-carboline that some folks have suggested may be responsible for this particular acacia, in some cases being stated to be orally active when brewed just by itself. So the hypothesis here would be that the MTHBC presents a strong enough inhibition of monoamine oxidase to allow for the fairly significant amounts of DMT to induce an oral, essentially an ayahuasca, or a comparable experience to ayahuasca. So this is some insight into the amount of extraction techniques that we have on the DMT nexus. There's sort of three main areas of extraction research that stand out as significant. First is the development of methodologies that significantly outperform those in the published scientific literature as far as final yield. Second is the development of dry tech methodologies, which offer novel approaches for the isolation of these compounds, some of which use only materials found in most grocery stores and are viewed as relatively safe approaches by many folks. And finally, we've carried out a number of side-by-side extractions as well as extraction questionnaires to sort of get a sense of what variables are at play during these extractions and to help people troubleshoot and minimize their difficulties when pursuing extractions. We've also attempted to create frameworks for analyzing subjective experiences that people come back with. We've proposed and carried out double-blind studies and blind studies into the subjective differences in smoking different colors and consistencies of DMT. These experiments have had sort of mixed results. The most successful one concluded that there were no differences observed in that particular case. We've also created guides to known interactions between various substances and the Substance Indexation Project, which is essentially an attempt to document and quantify the subjective experiences of psychedelics across the population of the Nexus or anybody who wishes to fill out the survey. These ongoing efforts sort of evidence the long-term, low-level data collection and sort of baseline research that takes place on an ongoing basis. So to examine what the future potential of underground psychedelic research might be, we have to ask, what can underground psychedelic research do? And I'd like to propose three broad areas for consideration. First is assisting sanctioned psychedelic researchers. Second is continuing to engage with pragmatic questions related to the extraction, ingestion, and use of these compounds. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, facilitating a paradigm of openly collaborative research between researchers of all stripes, ultimately transcending the academy. underground research has and will continue to provide anecdotal evidence and research questions that can be put to the test by sanctioned psychedelic researchers. Honestly, this really isn't something that we should have to work for if we continue to carry out these experiments and maintain open channels of communication with sanctioned researchers. Similarly, as underground research deals mainly with questions that are of pragmatic value to people using, extracting, and growing these plants and compounds, it's not really much of a stretch to assume that underground research will continue to engage with those. And seeing that ontological and existential questions are sort of the byproduct of many of these experiences, again, not really a stretch to consider that underground research will engage with that as well. So in my opinion, the main facet of what underground research can, should, and really must do as it goes forward is to open research to all interested parties. You really don't need a formal education or letters after your name to conduct viable or even important research. There are certain things for which extensive training is a necessity, but there's a myriad of really important research that can be carried out by people who have no credentials whatsoever. Personally, I have no clue how to run NMR, GCMS, or HPLC machines, but I'm perfectly capable of working with people who can. I can also relate to people who are asking important biological and botanical questions, people who have access to botanical vouchered specimens, and those same people working in the lab to coordinate research efforts that allow us to get vouchered copies or vouchered material that we can then analyze to conduct research as to what's in them. And in doing so, the DMT Nexus has conducted research that's literally at the cutting edge of human knowledge. Similarly, you don't need a PhD to do side-by-side extractions, run TLC plates, submit your own samples to a lab, or ask a number of pertinent questions surrounding these experiences. And there's a whole range of things that I haven't even mentioned that I'm sure many of you can think of. Psychedelic research should embody the psychedelic experience. Open, inquisitive minds and a participatory spirit should be the bare minimum necessary to engage in psychedelic research. There are areas of research that justify or that necessitate extensive training, but the mere existence of those areas don't necessitate or justify walling off the rest of it and declaring that underground psychedelic research is illegitimate. I mean, a brief look at the results shows that such a statement is simply untrue. I've encountered several sanctioned researchers for whom it's apparent that these statements make them somewhat uncomfortable. I'm kind of curious as to where their discomfort comes from. Is it because the information that we have to add to the body of psychedelic research is illegitimate? Is it because people with grant funding and access to these machines on a daily basis haven't simply put some plants in some machines? Or is it perhaps because this approach challenges the authority of the academy? But if that's the case, why shouldn't we be able to have a two-way discussion about our research findings on both sides of this perceived line of legitimacy? Why should underground research be considered little more than fodder for sanctioned researchers to make appropriately academic as they see fit? Personally, I think that two-way engagement would really be advantageous to people on both sides. And frankly, there's plenty of underground research that doesn't need sanctioned vetting or approval. Extraction methodologies alone show that's the case. So given that there are areas of research where sanctioned researchers are far more equipped than underground researchers, and other areas where underground researchers have an advantageous position, I would propose that a discrete partnership between sanctioned and underground researchers would make the most sense. While the current legal climate makes such a proposition somewhat risky, depending on who you talk to, the level of interaction between both sides could be very minimal and discrete. Most underground loci have ways that they can be contacted with minimal self-exposure, and I think that there's no reason to not start opening up a dialogue between researchers of all stripes. Communication within the broader community of people engaged in psychedelic research could be the most advantageous thing to all of us. The point of all of this is to say that psychedelics go far beyond the treatment of illnesses or the scope of the academy. Exploring psychedelics as medicines presents really illuminating and beneficial results, but this is hardly the full story. Psychedelics present the ability for personal enrichment, ranging from neurogenesis to prolonged feelings of openness and well-being to direct participation in the divine mystery of being. Psychedelics also challenge many of the ontological and existential frameworks that we're given since youth, limiting our research to understandings of the acute medicinal benefits within a disease prevention and treatment model really limits what we end up finding out about these compounds. The medicinal approach is perhaps the easiest pill for FDA, IRB, and other bureaucratic review boards to swallow, but that's precisely why we need underground psychedelic research, at least as long as these compounds are illegal and quite probably after prohibition ends. Personally, I look forward to seeing what a paradigm of collaborative psychedelic research between all of us has to offer. Thank you.